can go ahead and get started then. I'm Isabel Planton, and I'm a librarian in the Public Services Department here at the Lilly. How many of you have been here before? Okay, some, not all. Well, welcome back for those who have been, and welcome for the first time for those of you who are new. We are the Rare Book and Special Collections Library for IU Bloomington, and that means that most of the rare, sometimes one-of-a-kind items in the IU Library's collections are housed here. And we have both books, about 450,000 books, most of what you'll be seeing today, as well as manuscripts, which is everything that's not a printed published book we call a manuscript, and we have about 8.5 million manuscripts in the collection. So it is a massive collection. I believe that the size of the building is not evident looking at it from the outside. This is actually a 7-story building. We're on the 3rd story right now. 2 and 1 are sort of built into the hill down back that way. And that's all manuscripts on 2 and 1. This floor is the galleries, the reading room, some staff work areas and some stacks, and then 4 through 7 are all stacks. And then we also store a lot of materials off-site at this point because the building is completely at capacity. We've been here since 1960 in this building, and we needed our own building after J.K. Lilly Jr., who was the 3rd generation president of the Lilly Pharmaceutical Company in Indianapolis, gave IU a collection of about, I believe it was 17,000 books and 20,000 manuscripts, or maybe reverse those two numbers, 20,000 books and 17,000 manuscripts. Anyway, it was tens of thousands of items that he had collected over about a 30-year period, and he gave the entire collection to IU in the late 50s. He'd been especially interested in collecting books and manuscripts about American history and literature, British history and literature, the history of science and medicine. Those were his main areas of interest. He liked to collect off of lists of greatest hits in book collecting, and some of our finest things still today come from his collection. And then we have many things that have come before that because there were special collections prior to J.K. Lilly's gift, and we've also continued to receive donations and purchases since that time. So the collections continue to grow. We're really strong in, I can list off all kinds of things. Maps and atlases, of which you'll be seeing a lot today, and most of these materials came from Bernardo Mendel, who was another book collector especially interested in voyages of exploration into the so-called New World by Europeans. Many of our finest atlases are from him. We're really strong in cookbooks, children's literature, comic books and graphic novels, puzzles. We have about 33,000 mechanical puzzles, including the ones on display in the back of this room, which is called the Slocum Puzzle Room. About 16,000 miniature books, 150,000 pieces of sheet music, lots of publications of firsts in scientific discovery, especially in the Ian Fleming collection, which is on display in the main gallery right now. That was an area in which he collected books. We have a Gutenberg Bible, which is considered the first major text printed on a printing press in 1455, and that's on display in the room just past the main gallery, right under the bust of Abraham Lincoln. We have Audubon's Birds of America, the complete set of 435 plates, and that's just outside the door. Volume 1 is on display right now. It's one of the largest books in our collection. So the list just goes on and on. All kinds of incredible things for research purposes, as well as just things that might be of general interest in our collections. And it is all open to anybody who would like to see it. Nothing can be checked out here, and you can't go browsing in the stacks, but just about anything in our collections can be requested for use in the reading room. There are a couple things that are too fragile and may need special permission, but for the most part, everything is available. And the way you would do that, if you want to come back to see anything that you saw today, or something else strikes your fancy, or you're starting research and you want to just kind of see what we have, you just need to stop at the front desk, let the receptionist know that you want to use the reading room, and then they'll send you in, get registered. It takes about 5 minutes, and then whoever's on call at the time, between me and 3 or 4 other people in the department, will help you get started. If you have a more in-depth research question, I suggest that you email in advance, and I believe that on your handout, liblilly@indiana.edu, the email address is at the top of the sheet. That is our reference email, so if you ever have any questions for us, that's the place to start. Myself and several other librarians check that every day. And sometimes it's best if you have kind of no idea where to start to email us before you just drop in, because you might hit us at a time when we're really busy. And then, you don't get as much attention as if you give us a couple of days lead time. Do you guys have any questions about the library in general before we get into these books?
Just one question, the Book of Birds,
Yes.
do you still turn the page one every day? And so every time you come in, you would actually see a new bird?
Well,
even though you now have the digital display?
We have a digital display, which is just to the right when you head out that door, and that's not all of them. It's just some of the highlights. We've been doing it once a week. It's going to take over 8 years at that rate to get through the book. And we do make a video of it every week and put it up on Twitter and Instagram. We call it Flipping the Bird. I think we're very clever. And we try to come up with clever hashtags and puns on the birds. And, it's just a fun way to get. We have some bird aficionados out there who follow us religiously at this point.
They're just beautiful.
They are, yeah. We're going through a period of birds of prey right now. Not this week, but we had hawks for a couple of weeks. But anything else?
I noticed that you have many events in this particular room. How would
Yeah.
you best know what events happen when? Because you also have musical events,
Mhm.
obviously.
We try,
Lots of
I'd
events.
say the best place to check is, one, our website, and two, our Facebook page. If we have a major event going on, we will post about it on our Facebook page. Some events they're department specific or something, so they're not open to the public, but if it's a public event, it will go up on those places. We have used this piano a few times. It's been tuned recently, and it was used for an event within the past year. And we have a lute concert here every spring. I don't think we have a date for that yet, but Nigel North has played here before. And the Lincoln Room apparently has very good acoustics for lute music. Yeah, and this room is in constant use for classes, for lectures, for exhibition space. It's very multi-purpose. It used to also be our staff lounge, but then it became so busy we had to move the staff lounge somewhere else so people could eat also. Usually I would say everybody should come up for the map part, but with the video going on and how many of us there are, I'm gonna try to just talk about them as briefly as I can so that you guys get more time to look at them. I think that's probably the best way forward with this because, yeah, there's no way for everybody to gather around, I don't think. It would block the video. Okay. Well, I guess I'll just go ahead and start introducing the books then. Starting here at the beginning with 1482. I've kind of broken this up into a couple of books that I just think are interesting for the way that they visualize information, then moving into Latin American maps, and then moving into a more general kind of chronology of maps from a European standpoint, and then a couple of miscellaneous things at the end, and I'm going to wind my way through the room. So this one is from the very early days of printing, 1482. And it's called an incunable, which means from the cradle period. So there's up to 1500, all books are considered incunables. And this is the first printed edition of Euclid's works. Really a textbook that's still in use today, unlike many others. There's not a lot of other writings that are still being used in the way that this is. And it has over 400 illustrations of geometrical things. So this would have been, as I said, within the first few decades of printing, period, but they were also figuring out ways to print things other than text, which I think is really interesting. And I think that they used small pieces of wire to do these. There's also a lot of handwritten notes by an early owner in this book. This was originally in Greek, and then it was translated into Arabic, and then eventually into Latin. So it went through 3 translations before it came to be printed. So with that many translations, there may be some errors, probably, over centuries and so on. But this, as well as the Ptolemaic Atlas that is at the other end of this table, are both interesting examples of things that traveled from the ancient world to Arabic texts. They were translated into Arabic, and then they made their way back to Europe during the medieval or Renaissance period. So without the Arabic translation, we may have lost some of these texts. The second one is from 1570, and it's Euclid again. This one's in a little bit more delicate shape. I'm trying to be a little careful here. This is one we consider one of our earliest pop-up books in the collection. Let's see if I can crop it up. Because it actually has these little pasted-in flaps. That one's not going to move for me. That make some of these illustrations three-dimensional. And they're still intact after all these hundreds of years. And they're just in book 11, but there's ones that pop up into like three-dimensional pyramids and so on, which is really pretty impressive for a 16th century book. This is also the first English translation. I'm just going to leave it on for that section. And then moving into the Latin American collections, this book is from 1524. And it's the second letter of Cortez describing his explorations in Mexico. And this is a quite rare map, still intact in the book, of Tenochtitlan, or Mexico City, as it appeared before Cortez and the conquistadors destroyed it. So they arrived in 1519 and the city was destroyed by 1521. This book was published in 1524. The accuracy of this map is somewhat dubious, given that the buildings look European, but that is probably because the person who did the map making was someone in Europe who was going based on a written description of what the city looked like. So that you see a lot in books from this period, wherein the person illustrating for a European printing of a book was not among the first-hand witnesses of something in the New World. And this coastal map over here is the first one to have La Florida. It's the first depiction of Florida on a map. This is one where I'd ask that you just keep this book open to this page when you're looking around and keep these folds folded because it has torn a little bit here and it's quite delicate. This one is from 1596. That's the date we have in our cataloging, but it's believed that it might have originated as early as 1563 and been reused several times. It's a map from Tepeaca in Puebla in central Mexico, and it is actually a legal document that's describing a dispute over some land between native peoples of this area and Spaniards who had moved into the area. One of the Spaniards, we're missing half of him, but these are his legs. There's been some damage to this map over time. And I believe this is the land that's in dispute. What's interesting about this map is that it's showing sort of the convergence of native map making with European map making in one document as these two cultures were coming together in the late 16th century. These spirals of water are glyphs for like the origins of water sources. You've got this road down the middle that has footprints, which is a traditional map-making sign in native maps, but then it also has hoof prints on it, which shows that by this time the Spaniards had brought horses to this area. We've got suns on either side of the page and a star at the top to orient, west, east, and north. And I also think it's interesting the way that things sort of emanate out from the center of this map rather than being all oriented north-south. So you have the mountain pointing off this way, as well as the trees. This building is pointing off that way. It's all kind of coming out from here. And I've also set out this catalog that discusses several other maps of this kind that are from Mexico that are part of our collection. This one I think is the most colorful, perhaps, and that's the one I usually pull, but there are others shown in here as well and described. And then just another one. This one is from Bolivia from 1809, so quite a bit later. And this is depicting a battle that occurred at Irupana. And so this is looking quite a bit more European by this point, I think. But then again, it's just another interesting example of Latin American hand-drawn map from this period. And it's showing all the battles going on sort of simultaneously with a numbered list of every piece of action that occurred. And all these little tiny things that you can't see from where you're sitting, when you come up closer you'll be able to, they're like minuscule little soldiers fighting with tiny little guns that all have fire coming out of them and smoke. And then moving away from the Latin American materials into more European atlases. This is the Ptolemaic Atlas from 1482. And this predates the Columbus voyages.
Do they hand color that?
Yes, yeah.
Like with watercolors or
I'm not,
painting maybe?
I'm not exactly sure what the pigments are. They look to me sort of like watercolors. Let me flip to the main world map. You might know more about the pigments used than I do, I'm not sure.
Binders, not paintings.
Binders, well, then you already know more. So this is the world map. These are the winds blowing here. So as you can see, we've got Africa, Europe, Asia, no North or South America depicted. There's a large terra incognita down here that was believed to exist up until the voyages of Cook, I believe. These atlases, such as this, were based on writings of Ptolemy, who was a 2nd century Alexandrian, who had charted out 8,000 places worldwide at their latitude and longitude, which is what all of these lists are at the beginning of the text. So when these writings made their way to Europe in the early 1400s, the maps didn't exist anymore that Ptolemy had drawn, but they were able, using these charts, to draw maps based on that information. And this carried on for quite a while, and then as knowledge and explorations continued and better math and science, etc., they became more accurate over time. But this is one of the first German ones with the maps in it. These are woodblock maps. And yeah, they're all beautifully hand-colored. It also is the first atlas to include a depiction of Greenland. So here we even see in this one of the first printed Ptolemaic atlases that new knowledge is being acquired, and it's being sort of incorporated into these ancient writings and map-making techniques. The next one is from 1524. And this is one of the first major texts after the Columbus voyages that sort of began the period that started to make Ptolemaic writings obsolete with more accurate math and measurement. And this is the Peter Apian text that has some of the very first illustrations of the world that have America included. I've got the pages marked so you'll be able to see when you come up here. And some of them have these volvels as well that are still intact. This is perhaps one of the most intact editions of this book from 1524 known to exist, because I believe all of the volvels are here in all of their pieces. So it's got these movable parts that are tied on with a bit of silk thread. And there are, I'm trying to see if I know how many there are. I don't have a number for how many volvels, but I do have them listed out what they are if you have questions about them. It also has a fairly long description of America in chapter 4, describing the Native Americans and plants that have been discovered, which I have a translation of if you're interested in that. This is its original binding also, which I think is pretty incredible. It still has the ties. And then from 1603, this is Bayer. This is one of the first atlases to cover the entire celestial sphere with 51 star charts. And this binding is definitely not the original. This is quite an ugly binding. This is an example, I think, of information visualization gone wrong, because they printed the star chart on one side and the description of it on the back. So you can't actually consult one and the other together. And also there's quite a bit of kind of bleed through, so you're seeing the text through the image. When they printed it in the second edition, the two were separate volumes, so you'd have one that's the charts and one that's the description of them. But unfortunately, I guess that one was full of typographical errors, so they just couldn't win. But they tried to improve it that way. And I think that you have in your notes about the stellar nomenclature that Bayer came up with that he introduced with this book that's still in use today, with the Greek letter alpha for the brightest star, and then so on down through the Greek alphabet, and then picking up with Latin if you run out. And there are some star charts in here of newly discovered constellations as well toward the back that I've marked, as well as the northern and southern hemisphere, the last two maps. And I think the way this was originally bound would have been half as wide, and these were all folded over into the book. And that's probably why they decided to rebind it, because that's not great for the paper to be folding and unfolding it, but they just didn't pick the most beautiful binding material when it was redone at some point. This next one is the Mercator Atlas from 1613. And it has an extra world map that's inserted in the front. Well, this is North and South America. So by this point, we're getting fairly detailed maps of the New World by 1613. And Mercator was mostly working during the 16th century. This is a third French edition of this particular atlas, so this is actually after his death, but his popularity continued well beyond the years of his life. And it was published by Jodocus Hondius, who is pictured here with Mercator. I really think this is a beautiful illustration of map-making technique. Globes. Wish we had globes in our collection. And then here's the world map. So we're getting a more spherical depiction of the Earth. There are still sea monsters, and there's still obviously quite a bit of inaccuracy in North and South America. This Terra Australis, still this large land mass is, map makers are unsure about what's down there. And again, these are all hand-colored, really beautiful and quite detailed. Mercator did all of his own charting and map-making, and really made it into an art form, I think. And this was also one of the first books to actually be titled Atlas. The word atlas became synonymous with Book of Maps around this time.
How many of those books might have been printed?
You know, I'm not sure about that. It seems like they were so lavish. I don't think they must not have been printed in extremely large editions.
And maybe some never got colored, that could also
Right.
be.
Yeah, and they're colored all differently. I mean, there's variations between them as well. Same with the Ptolemaic ones. These next two are part of a multi-volume set. This is the Dudley Sea Atlas. Apparently, when I pronounce this word, it sounds like I'm saying deadly. It's Dudley. And he was an Englishman who was attempting to chart every known coastline on the planet. And this project took about 12 years. He was 73 by the time this was printed. And so these are the coastal profiles in this volume, and this is not it. I just pulled one of the coastal profile volumes. There are more in our stacks. And then I also brought along this volume that includes some depictions of navigational instruments. And here we've got more volvels, like in the Peter Apian, which are, with a few exceptions, I think there are one or two that might be slightly broken, but for the most part, they're still intact. And some have been sort of backed with something to keep them from breaking off. But this was a massive undertaking as far as the printing of it, because these are, unlike what we've seen so far, mostly wood cuts. These are engravings that slightly different illustration process that involves large metal plates, and you can get a finer level of detail, but you can actually feel the plate mark on these. That's how you know an engraving, because they have to use an even higher pressure press to print an engraving. And so even all of the lettering on here would have been engraved rather than typeset, because you can't actually do typesetting and engraving on the same printing press. So just a massive undertaking. And I think that these are definitely more of an intellectual kind of a book than they are a practical one, because I don't think somebody on a ship would be taking along a book of this size. We don't have a lot of books that are of the kind that would actually be used for navigation on ships by sailors. More so we have things that would have been owned by people who were interested in the concept of travel and discovery. Then heading over this way, we have multiple copies, various editions of the Blau atlases. These are from the time that was really the height of Dutch map-making supremacy, which ranged from 1550 to 1675. And this particular edition is from 1658 to 1672, so toward the end of that period. These ones are attributed to Joan Blau, but his father as well had been a map maker, and they were a large map-making family. His father before him, and then he was the map maker of the Dutch East India Company. So they were in an official capacity map making for the Dutch in their explorations. This is one volume out of an 11-volume set, of which we have all of them. I brought Spain. So this is just dedicated to Spain. And these were really lavish books. This was the height of luxury to be able to own something like these. And I think on your handout, I kind of laid out how expensive these would be. It's about the cost of renting a bookshop for a year could get you a set of these Blau atlases. And some people even had furniture to house them. It was a status symbol to have these if you were wealthy enough. And by this point, we're getting into maps that are so elaborate in their cartouches and the borders of them. The accuracy is definitely improving, but also these are meant to just be beautiful, as are the Mercator and so on. They also, in addition to having maps, also depict specific buildings. It's kind of like touring the country and its highlights, going through these, the layouts of buildings. See if I can find anything else visual. There are some places in this one where it has been eaten through by the green, which is an acidic color that will eat away at paper. So be a little careful turning through this one because there are a couple of places where it's torn. And then to go along with that, from about the same period, this is from 1680 and was produced for the Dutch East India Company, but in a much more practical capacity. This is a coastal profiles of the North Atlantic to the South China Sea. So these were for people who were more interested in the coasts than the interior of the land, so that they could recognize where they were while sailing. And the one that I have marked is here, I believe it's Krakatoa. It was a volcano that erupted, and so the coastal profile changed after the eruption of the volcano, and it's been erased. Which I think is interesting, that this was like a map that was in progress and could be changed depending on how the landscape changed. Then we have from 1739, this was another multi-year project. This took about 5 years to produce. And this is a map of Paris. These map makers were given permission to go into every building in Paris in an attempt to get the most accurate survey of the entire city possible. And that includes, places where there are piles of wood next to the water. And every tree has a little shadow. It's incredible the level of detail in here. Let's see if I can prop it up just a little bit. And I can only imagine how large, it would probably take up half the floor of this room if these maps were laid out end to end to show the entirety of Paris. Similar project was undertaken for London around the same time, and we have that in our collection as well.
So for London, they actually created maps which made it look really nice, even though it was a stinky and rather non-nice environment. And then people which saw those maps, they're like, oh my God, my town, my hometown could look so nice. And that actually created the energy and will to make it nice.
That's really interesting.
And I don't know if this was the
I'm
same
sure that
for-
there was
for-
similar sections of Paris that were made to look nice. Then we get into more miscellaneous items over here. This item from 1794 is a map of the various paths of life, which you're either going to end up in the peaceful ocean or the bottomless pit, depending on how you live your life. So it's very moral, trying to preach a certain moral set of behaviors, especially for children. And this was also turned into games for children, of some of which we have at least facsimiles of in our collection. Very much based on the popularity of Pilgrim's Progress. And so this is one that I think is just great to come close and read over, the ways that you can go wrong or right in your life. And then we've got this Serio-Comic war map. I'm skipping around a little bit. This is from 1877, and I'll see if I can hold it up at all. This is just a great example of a political cartoon, if you will, depicting each country as an animal or a person, as a way to explain the relationships between the different countries at this particular time, with Russia as this big octopus that's got its, kind of reach going toward Germany and Turkey and so on.
That's what I think is trying to capture it. Yeah. The octopus or the Russia is depicted over there, trying to capture or engulf
Mm-hmm.
all the other
Yeah,
countries.
yeah.
That's what
Mhm.
it is.
And it's quite a famous one. I think this has been reproduced in a lot of textbooks and things like that. This one is too large for me to pick up, so I'll just mention briefly so you guys will get a chance to look at it when you're over here. This is from 1802 from Nagasaki. The earliest map from the Bunkindo firm, and it's showing, let's see, the bay with Dutch ships and Chinese junks, and there's a table here that is sea and land distances from Nagasaki to various other places in Japan. And this is a woodblock map, again hand colored. And then finally, over on the piano, something from World War II. So I'm skipping way into more recent times. This is a geographical history of the 32nd General Hospital in the European theater from 43 to 45. And this belonged to a woman who was from Indiana, who was with this nursing unit that went and saw a fair amount of action in England and France, and their travels all around, and then back home to Indiana. And there's some descriptive pieces that come with it. This only came to the collection a few years ago, and we have the original letter from the person who donated it to us here. And then finally, I've just set out a few finding aids. If you're interested in learning more about maps in our collections, not everything is described online. We still use card catalogs quite extensively here, like the old-fashioned card catalog drawers in the reading room. And I've brought just a few of the drawers that list out maps in our collection, and these are mostly arranged by geographical location, as well as a couple of catalogs from previous main gallery exhibitions. This one is on Bernardo Mendel, who I mentioned was the collector of most of the atlases in our collection. And another one on discovery and science during the Renaissance that describes some of the items on display here. And then just a big fat reference book about the mapping of North America. The folks who made this book will cite in here anytime that there's a copy of a book in the Lilly Library that they're describing, which is helpful if you're looking through this and you're like, oh, I want to see that. You can see if we have it or not. And we do have some of them, but certainly not all. Do you guys have any questions before you get up to look at things? Okay. Well, let me just say a few things about handling before you get up. I've lifted things up and kind of like shown them around, but please keep them in the supports that they're in and not pick them up. A few of them are quite fragile. This one has a back cover that is detached, so be careful when turning the pages. just be, in general, slow and careful turning the pages, because these books are quite old. The paper, in most cases, is very sturdy because it's made of linen stock rather than more acidic material, but nonetheless, it would be a great shame if they were torn. So just be slow and careful and kind of know what your hands are doing as you're turning pages, and try not to rest your weight on them. If there are fold-out maps, let me know. I can help you fold them out. I know there's one in this book. There might be others. And then just let me know if you have any questions. You can take non-flash photos if you like. And you can also look around in the galleries when you're done here. Yes?
How do you, like, under what conditions do you preserve the books such that the color still remains?
Well, we don't really do a lot of treatment to the color within the books. We try to keep them closed and away from light whenever they're not used. Most of these books also go in our vault, so it is dark and it's cool and humidity controlled there, which is all pretty much ideal conditions for books. So having them closed in cases, locked away in the dark is really the best thing. Yeah.
Are these books restored?
We do. We have a conservation department with 2 full-time people in it. They can repair tears. They can make custom boxes for anything in our collection. They can put, covers back on if they've fallen off and that kind of thing. There's also paper conservators that work out at the ALF Preservation Lab that help us with that kind of thing too.
Yeah, are all these the original books that have been copied into different versions of the book, or?
Yes. Some cases, like the Mercator, that's a later edition from 1613, whereas he was creating editions earlier than that in the 16th century. But for the most part, what I've shown here are first editions of these books, where possible, yeah.
If they are stored in the vault, how much longer would they last? Do you know?
I don't know exactly.
Because it's pretty amazing that they made it so far.
Yeah.
And most likely, many of the things that we generate today won't be around in 500 years, right? So it's just amazing that we get to still see them.
The materials that were used, like in the 15th century, the paper that was used is so much sturdier than the paper for 19th century books, which, like Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, I think, is one of the most fragile things in our collection that people always want to see, but we can barely let people handle it anymore because the binding is falling apart and the paper is so very, very fragile because of the acidic content. But some of these older things, and then especially items on vellum that are even older than this, are in very good condition. The colors are so lively and bright. Also, the vault is built to withstand a nuclear blast. This building is from 1960, and that was one of the things that was touted at the time that the library opened in articles about the building.
Yeah. And that's what's typically done. You destroy the culture of the nation you want to
Yeah.
take over.
Or Yellowstone, whenever that was.
So thanks so much, and everybody, please go to your favorite map and see which one it is. And I think we have still people around to answer questions.
Yeah, you've got plenty of time to look around now.